Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
The title of this evening's address here in the Wesley Theatre has a sense of disturbance about it, I have to confess. Deserting Jesus focuses upon the doubt, indeed the rejection, of some of the early followers of Jesus. It comes in a section which serves as a thought-provoking conclusion to what really is a very massive chapter to this point in studying John's Gospel in John chapter 6. You could say, in a way, that it goes as far as we find in the most explicit and challenging offer that Jesus ever made in his ministry, and from which many of the early followers turned away. It's worth noting there's a distinction between the 12 disciples and the broader group of people that clearly were around. It's at this point that it's reinforced for the first time in John when he refers to the 12, talking about them by name as a distinct, defined, set-apart, called group of people. So we read in our text, verse 66 of John chapter 6. From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. Many of his disciples, you see, there's a lot of debate, do people fall back? As if with the right to even have the debate, the Bible tells us that's exactly what happened. Some people turned away. Some people deserted the call of Jesus Christ. And the reference to the disciples here, it would seem to me, is a reference to a broader group than just the 12. It clearly relates to another group of people because we're told that many of his disciples, not one of them, it's not a case of Philip's having a bad day, he turned round. Many of the disciples chose to go a different way. They ceased to want to associate with him. And this follows what's described a little earlier in this particular chapter as a hard teaching. Remember, on hearing this is when Jesus has been talking about body and blood. He's been talking about not just that as a symbol, a picture, a Eucharistic comment, but talking about it in terms of receiving him into our lives. We read, it says, on hearing this, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? A hard teaching. The people were offered a great gift, but for some it's just too difficult to understand, too difficult to grasp, too demanding to be able to take it into themselves and understand what the calling really is. How could anybody walk away from the call of Christ in their lives? Especially whenever we read a call of Christ, there's always the equipping, empowering, and gifting that goes with it. So much has been offered. At this point, we mustn't be reluctant to address the fact that many people encountered Jesus, chose to follow him, but found this kind of saying hard. In this case, it follows the Eucharistic challenge when Jesus said, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Gosh, unless you have no life in you whatsoever. We can't avoid the fact that when we examine the Gospels, the Jesus we meet there is radically different than the Jesus that so many people portray. So many people have and I want to say this carefully, a soft, nice, a polite Jesus, a comfortable Jesus, one that we could easily admire. We could even say, oh, we're very happy with this Jesus. That's fine, but when you read the Gospels, the disciples who were nearest him, those who'd been called, those groups that gathered around him, found many of the things he said very hard. It was a long cry from the Sunday school picture of Jesus Christ that we so often in our minds portray and hold to. The Jesus we meet in the Gospels, to use Bruce's conclusion, gave offence right and left. We remind ourselves how the offence presented itself. At times, those close to him found his sayings disconcerting the disciples. He upset the religious leaders by notions about religious propriety, which they found very unpalatable. He enjoyed the company of very questionable people. And he set out on a road that would ultimately lead to a cross. This is not a gentle picture of Jesus. It is something far, far I even want to use the word tougher, far more demanding, far more stand up and really face the reality of following. So there's something very, very real about this. It becomes hard for the first audience of Jesus because we consider the whole of John together. We know that to believe in Jesus is to be united with him in faith. That's a Johannine contribution to discipleship, that we are somehow united with Christ. We receive him and he becomes a part and parcel of our life. And we're told in this great discourse about the Holy Communion, the Lord's Supper, the feeding of the crowd, the picture of Jesus as the bread of life, we're told that there was a definite reaction to him when he talked about these things. At the beginning of Mark, we read the people were amazed as he brought healing to a man who was possessed by an evil spirit. And we read in Mark, the people were so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching and with such authority?" Here in John, there's an overwhelming sense of amazement at the power of his teaching. But there's something about it that causes some of them to hold back. No, more than that, preachers say it as it is, that causes some of them to desert him, to leave him. The demand is real and great. It might be a similar experience to the rich young man. You remember the rich young man who, when it was laid before him, what it was necessary for him, if he was going to be a disciple, what it was necessary for him to attain eternal life. He was given a list and he was able to tick them off mentally, one after the other. But Jesus told him, you've got to sell and give away. And he chose to desert, to go his own way. We may not have liked that, but that's what actually happened in our New Testament. It's a very, very powerful sense of teaching. Similar experience. Both cases, the message to the rich young man and to the disciples there is going to be that if you are to follow Jesus, it must embrace the whole of your life. The teaching of Jesus then and now is at odds with the way many people understand life in our culture. I'll expand on that a little in a moment. Much of life around us tells us we're in charge. So everything's about the choices we make. We are told, our parents often say to children, and I understand this, and in the classroom we say, good choice, good choice. The danger of it is the assumption that it's all about our choices. Well, there is an element of that, but it's more than that. It is embracing the lordship of Christ in our lives. It is embracing in a real and powerful way something more than just some choices that we make. It is about a fundamental commitment that takes us much further. Spend a little time in a bookshop if you can find one. And you'll find that a large amount of printed material focuses on the feeling good about ourselves. Even advice about how to be successful. Nothing better than a book is it tells you how to be successful, how to be thin. I don't know about that one. How to be rich, how to get on, how to be a great leader. All these things that seem to suggest that all the work is on our side. And all the things that we do will make those things come true. There's even the suggestion in religious circles from religious writers and preachers. They're not exempt from the error too. The suggestion that somehow if we go to the right church, we believe in the right way, everything's going to be fine. See, following Jesus is far more demanding than that. It's not going to be the easy way. It is not going to be that which enables us to respond and all will be good. It is the demanding way. And the demanding way caused some of those who were there at the first time to desert him and choose another way. The closing paragraph in this chapter is a substantial bit of that teaching. But later in the Gospel of John, we'll also read this. Very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Those who love their life will lose it, and those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. These are John's discipleship teaching that are so very alike the teaching of Jesus to follow in discipleship in Mark and the other synoptic Gospels. it would appear that verse 67, Jesus wants to be sure of the position of the 12. Knowing that people were deserting, Jesus asked the 12, "You don't want to leave me too, do you?" Very powerful that. What a question. So Simon Peter answered him. It doesn't say, incidentally, this is another one of the, it doesn't say, Jesus said to Simon Peter. Jesus spoke to the disciples and Simon Peter said, "I'll answer that one. I know the answer to that one. We will not." And he was very, very sharp and ready to answer in that kind of way, to be able to make a response. The passage has caused me to ask myself, why is it that people desert Jesus? Being continually aware of aspects. Now let me tell you the easy answer that some church traditions have. That when people do it, they say, well, they weren't really there in the first place. I'm sorry to tell you that I have met people that have had about them the attractiveness of Jesus. And then later I have met them and they have not. Now that's hard. It'd be much better if we could come up with that slick answer, wouldn't it? And say they weren't really there. Because that's an easy way of handling the difficult question. They deserted Jesus. That's the Bible's teaching here. And it's strong. And so I said to myself, why do people desert Jesus if they do? And I offer you a number of suggestions. People desert Jesus because it involves going the whole way. For the second time in this chapter, we have a similar point being made. In the same way that Jesus not only gives bread, but is bread, Jesus asks his people to follow him, but to do more than that, to enter into a living relationship with him. In doing so, we share in the purposes and ministry of Jesus, with all the implications that involves. Jesus was well aware. I like this word grumbles. It's a good biblical gospel word, actually. Jesus was aware they were grumbling. Did he hear them? I don't know. But I know that it's a very powerful word. The similarity, one writer reminds us, the similarity between his disciples' protest and that of the crowd is established by the repetition of the verb to grumble. Jesus' awareness of his disciples' grumbling is an insight into the way Jesus understood human nature. It's interesting that when people are asked to sign a document, what do people do if they get handed a document? Sensible people, if they're handed a legal document, will what? Look at the small print. Don't just read it carefully. Look very carefully at what's there. If you enter into a contract, you read the small print to make sure that it doesn't have later implications as far as you're concerned. You know, the great thing about Jesus, it seems to me, is that Jesus is very different. He doesn't hide his call in the small print. The call of Jesus is loud and clear and strong and bold. And it leaves you and I to make our choices and responses. Now, that response may lead to deserting him. You and I have to face that challenge. We have to face up to the gospel call in our lives and what that might mean. The Greek word used throughout this chapter for hard doesn't mean hard to understand. I mean, that's one thing. When you say it's a hard saying, we might say it's a hard saying because they can't understand it. No, the word doesn't mean hard to understand. It means something far more hard to accept. Hard to accept the calling of Jesus in our lives. We need to understand it's a lifelong call. It's going all the way. When you make your stand, when you decide to follow Jesus, you are not given the option somewhere to follow on a kind of sidetrack. You're not going on one of our mayor's little cycle tracks while the rest go streaming past you, or the other way if you're in the queue. You're going to have to decide. You're in the full stream of discipleship. There's not a discipleship for Peter, for John, for James, the Apostle Paul, for John Wesley, for every leader there's ever been at this mission. There is one discipleship, and you and I have been called to it, and we must make our call and response to that. And some deserted him. I find this very strong. One devotional writer had the thought, neither does he ask anything of us that he's not prepared to give himself. What Jesus calls us to is a life that involves a love towards God and acceptance of his purposes. Jim Elliot was a Christian martyr in Ecuador in the 1950s. He kept a very detailed diary. And at the age of 22, in the diary that we turned up later, he wrote in his diary a saying that I've always believed was one of the finest ever sayings by a missionary in the world. He said this: "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." You have to decide whether you're prepared to be committed to that. And you really have to stand for him. And standing for him sometimes when your friends don't like it, when your family don't like it. Standing in that place that is right. Following Jesus Christ with all that you have and all that you are and all the very best intentions of the Holy Spirit in your lives. 7 years later, Jim Elliot met a violent death because of his faith as a missionary. He demonstrated in his own life that following Jesus means going all the way. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Among the disciples were those who had come to understand that truth in their own lives. Thomas, who would know what it was to go and give his life in India. Peter, according to certain traditions of the church, that would die, maybe crucified upside down. These disciples would soon learn in their own lives that the road that Jesus was on, the road to the cross, would be the road that they would have to partake and would have to be a part of themselves. The cross becomes not only the climax of the ministry of Jesus, it becomes the starting point for all our discipleship. And then secondly, people desert Jesus when the word and deed element becomes clear. Here's a Wesley mission insight on this particular passage. The events that follow in Jesus' ministry will prove the point that he's making continually. You're not called to follow Jesus Christ in some obscure religious experience that makes you feel good. There have been those who have placed their own religious experience above everything else. We're not given that option. To have some obscure religious experience and following, that's how it is for us. You're not called to follow Jesus Christ alone. Down history, some people have wanted to do that. They've wanted to go and be on their own and have a secret personal discipleship. You're not given that option. And you're not called to follow Jesus Christ in a way that separates devotion and deeds. They're both together. So that my believing in Jesus, my embracing through the Holy Spirit, that life of discipleship and service, and what I do on Monday at 11 o'clock, or what I do on Saturday at 10 o'clock, they're all together a piece. This word and deed thing is part of the gospel call. And it's a challenge for all of us. There are some folks who struggle with the fact that followers might defect. However hard it is to come to terms with it, most of us will become familiar. As a minister, you go back to churches and places you've ministered in before. I've always found it one of the saddest things of all when you go and you look out because you're back and you know very well that people come because you're there and they're not always there that Sunday. And you look out on a sea of faces and you're looking out for Bill. You're looking out for Jane. And they're not there. And you do a mental, you continue and you talk, and then suddenly you might just say in casual with one of the leaders of the elders of the church, "See, Jane's not here this morning." And they said, "No, that's very sad." And they will tell you a story. This is not a little bit of New Testament talk. This is the reality of what it means to follow. Sometimes the call is so demanding that people today say, "It is too demanding for me." Deserting him can be so challenging. Some drift away for all kinds of reasons. We may be fair weather followers people who like it when it's going okay. We may even have family and friends for whom what I'm talking about here makes an awful lot of sense because we've seen it. At the end of chapter 6, we have a reference to Judas. Oh gosh, you say, whenever you see the references to Judas, ask when they've been placed. It's been placed in a section where many people deserted him. Now that really gets very close to home, doesn't it? When we talk about one of those that were called amongst the 12. And if you're one of those people who struggles with this whole business and thought that some people deserted him, remember, Jesus chose Judas. Judas chose a different way. But let me move on. People desert Jesus when they realize they can't be anonymous in their discipleship. They can't be anonymous in their discipleship. The hard call would be real. Not only for those in the crowd, but also for the 12. We mustn't underestimate the challenges faced by people in public life when endeavoring to maintain a Christian discipleship. I recall preaching a series of sermons, and the name of the series of sermons was, "What is the Point?" And far beyond the life of the local church, we sent out invitations into the life of the local city, and we said to people, please come along. These sermons are not written for church people. They're written for you. And quite a lot of people came, well above our normal congregation from outside the church. And I noticed a man who came in halfway through the first hymn, and he left halfway through the last hymn. As a preacher, knowing that you often get to the door, I felt like I wanted to get on roller skates to get out there. It was a series of about 8 sermons, and he was there every one of them. But I did manage to make contact with him and sat down with him in my office. And we talked together at length about ministry and life and what it was that was a great challenge to him in his own personal life. You see, he wanted to remain an anonymous disciple. He wanted to say, preacher, I agree with you about all this call of Jesus, but don't you understand? I've got a very significant and important job. So I want to be one of those people who carries a little card of belonging secretly hidden in my coat. Just about 3 years ago, Carol and myself were visiting the United Kingdom on holiday. And there was a small walk-through mall that came onto a main street. Now, I don't know if you've ever found yourself, you're looking through the glass into the shop here, and at 90 degrees opposite, there's another glass window, and you see the people looking into the shop that way. And lo and behold, there was my friend with his wife looking into the same shop. Our eyes connected. Now, I know our eyes connected. And he turned away and he walked down the street with more than a degree of sadness in my heart. Because there are those who desert Jesus for all kinds of different reasons. When I began my ministry, I worked with a very gifted preacher. I recall many of his sermons. He's been in heaven many, many years now. In one address, he compared 2 texts like a master expositor. He held these 2 texts up like diamonds, shining on themselves and throwing light and pouring light onto the other. In Luke 9:50, when speaking to the disciples, Jesus said, "For whoever is not against you is for you." And that wasn't the preacher's text in all. And then he had another text from 2 chapters later. In chapter 11:23, it said, "Whoever is not with me is against me." Initially, those 2 texts, as the preacher said, may look as though they're in conflict with each other. They may look as they've got a different message. But no, they don't. They have the same message. And that is that neutrality and anonymity is not possible with Jesus Christ. If you're serious about following him, then you not only meet him here, but you meet him on the pathways of life. That may well have been a reason why Nicodemus came in the middle of the night. We don't know. I think there's more to say about Nicodemus, but he came by night, perhaps because at that point, as a leader within the Sanhedrin, he didn't want people to know what or who he was about or what commitment was going to mean for him. I actually believe there's more to the story of that, because when it comes to the end and the death and resurrection of Jesus, Nicodemus is still around. But there's something that's in all of that. Now, there's a story told from the ministry of John Wesley. John was talking with someone who thought they could be a Christian all by themselves. They were holding forth about this anonymous business and this singularity and this identity, that discipleship's possible all on my own, all by myself. And Wesley realized that it was going to be very difficult to win this person over by mere argument. So he got up from his chair, he picked up a pair of tongs, and then he picked out a hot coal from the fire. He picked out the coal and placed it on the hearth. And he sat and he watched it. And this hot coal went out. The message was very powerful as they sat there. He didn't need to even explain the point. It's difficult, if not impossible, to be a single coal burning by ourselves. We're a people who have to recognize what it is to do the will of God. And the hard saying for us is that we must test our loyalty and commitment to Jesus Christ together. Our calling must take us above our single and personal concerns. We must be invited to give every ounce of our belonging to that which is good. There are some very interesting words found in the Jewish Talmud. People are born with hands clenched and die with them wide open. Hands clenched, wide open. Entering life with desire to grasp everything. Leaving this world, all we possessed has slipped from us. So what is a hard saying? That to follow Jesus will demand everything is the only logical and sensible model of discipleship that there is. There is no popular discipleship. There's no religion on the side. There's no kind of commitment to Jesus that you can take or leave. It's something more than that. There have been people in every age who have turned away from following Jesus. I suppose the challenge for me is, will you be one of them?